welcome to your deep dive into the JFK assassination.
Yeah.
But we're not rehashing, the same old story. You've heard a
Ah.
million times about, the grassy knoll, the
Yeah.
magic bullet theory.
Yeah.
We're going way beyond that today.
Okay.
You shared some really fascinating stuff with us.
Oh, good.
Declassified documents,
Yeah.
witness testimonies, expert analysis,
Wow.
and we're going to dig into some of the most puzzling aspects
Okay.
of the case, especially the evidence around Lee Harvey Oswald and the possibility of lookalikes.
Great.
So ready to go down the rabbit hole.
Let's do it.
All right, one of the first things that really jumped out at me from the stuff you sent was this account from Lyle Aho in Stanley, North Dakota.
Okay.
He claims he met someone who looked a lot like Lee Harvey Oswald back in the summer of 1956.
Yeah, that's a curious one.
Yeah.
Aho describes this guy, who also called himself Lee, as being about 5'10", same height, and billed as Oswald, acting suspiciously and claiming to be hired by the government to recruit people to go to Cuba.
Cuba. Yeah. In 1956.
Yeah.
That's way before Castro came to power.
Exactly.
This doesn't really add up, does it?
It really makes you wonder what Oswald or someone pretending to be him was doing in North Dakota at that time.
Right.
Was it truly Oswald on some secret mission before joining the Marines? Or was it an imposter? A deliberate attempt to create a certain image of him even before the assassination was even planned? And why North Dakota?
Yeah.
It's not exactly, a hotbed of international intrigue.
Right.
Well, not necessarily. You have to remember that North Dakota in the 1950s was a pretty complex place. It had a history of radical politics with a strong socialist movement and even some activity from the American Communist Party. Then you factor in the oil boom, which brought in wealthy and influential figures like H.L. Hunt.
Right.
So you had this mix of local interests that could have easily intersected with national and even international events.
Yeah, and Aho places this encounter in Stanley, which is near the Whiskey Gap, a known route for smuggling and covert operations.
Yeah.
It's not totally outlandish to think that something shady could have been happening there.
Right, and that raises another question. If this was staged, what purpose did it serve? Was it to establish a certain profile for Oswald, maybe even as a communist sympathizer years before the assassination?
It's a lot to think about. It really challenges the idea of Oswald as a lone wolf, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Makes you wonder if he was involved in something bigger even before the events in Dallas.
Yeah.
But let's shift gears for a moment
I'm
and
sorry.
talk about the witness testimonies after the assassination, specifically those that cast doubt on the official narrative.
This is where things get really interesting. You have conflicting accounts, memory gaps, and even potential manipulation of witnesses, which all raise questions about what really happened that day.
One of the most striking examples from the material you sent is the case of Amos Mewins, the teenager, who claimed to have seen the shots coming from the Texas School Book Depository.
Right.
His testimony was instrumental in directing police attention to the TSBD, right?
It was, but there are some problems with his account. For one thing, the timing of his observations seems off when you compare them to the photographic evidence from that day, especially the photos taken by Jim Murray. It suggests that Ewins might not have actually seen what he claimed to see, or that his memory was faulty, or even that someone might have influenced his testimony to fit a particular narrative.
It's unsettling to think that someone might have been coached to say certain things, but it's not the only example of witness discrepancies. We also have the case of Howard Brennan, who gave the initial description of the wanted person that matched Oswald.
Yeah, Brennan's story is full of inconsistencies. His initial description led to the broadcast alert that helped identify Oswald, but then later, his account of how he gave that information and who he spoke to changed. Even the official records contradict each other on these details. It makes you wonder if someone was pressuring him to change his story.
So we have two key witnesses whose accounts are shaky at best, potentially even manipulated.
Right.
It makes you question the reliability of the whole investigation, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And then there's the mystery surrounding the timeline of Officer Tippett's death.
Right. The official timeline puts Tippett's shooting at 1:15 p.m., but some of your sources, including the testimony of reporter Hugh Ainsworth, suggest that it might have happened earlier, possibly as early as 1:00 p.m.
That's a significant difference.
Yeah.
A 15-minute discrepancy throws off the whole sequence of events.
Exactly. And to add to the confusion, there are gaps in the audio recordings from police radio transmissions that day, potentially obscuring crucial information about what really happened and when.
So not only do we have unreliable eyewitness accounts, but we're also missing pieces of the official record. It's like someone went through and selectively edited the evidence to fit a particular story.
And we can't forget Domingo Benavides, who tried to use Tippett's radio to call for help. He
Right.
claims that multiple citizens were already calling in about the shooting, which contradicts the official timeline and raises the possibility of a coordinated effort to control the information flow.
It all paints a very different picture than the one we've been told for decades. It suggests that the timeline itself was manipulated, that crucial details were omitted or altered, and that witnesses might have been influenced to support a predetermined conclusion.
It's a disturbing thought, isn't it?
It is.
If they were willing to manipulate the timeline, what else were they willing to tamper with?
That's what I keep coming back to.
Yeah.
And it leads us to the next layer of this whole thing, the physical evidence itself,
Yeah.
which, according to your sources, might be even more suspect than we realize.
Let's dive into that. We'll start with the rifle,
The alleged murder weapon.
the one and only. But did you know that the serial number on that rifle, the one found in the TSBD, could have been tampered with?
Wait, are you saying that the murder weapon itself might be part of the cover-up?
It's definitely something to consider. The foreign rifle marking system used at the time made it relatively easy to remove and replace serial numbers. And you have to remember that unmarked barrels were readily available back then, so it's entirely possible that the murder weapon was actually a carefully chosen substitute planted to frame Oswald.
That's a chilling thought. So we can't even be sure that the rifle they found was the one Oswald actually ordered.
It's a possibility we can't ignore.
But what about the bullet? Wasn't there one bullet that supposedly went through both Kennedy and Connolly? The one they call CE-399.
Yes, the magic bullet, as some call it. But the story of how that bullet was found is incredibly suspicious.
Oh, really?
It just appears on a stretcher at Parkland Hospital hours after the shooting, and the official explanation of its discovery doesn't really hold water.
So you're saying a key piece of evidence just materializes out of thin air?
Convenient for some, perhaps.
That's awfully convenient, isn't it?
It raises serious questions about whether that bullet was planted. And then you have the other bullet fragments, the ones that were too damaged for a definitive ballistic match. Their origin is murky, and the possibility of them being switched out, maybe even with fragments shaved from CE-399 itself, is a disturbing one.
So we're talking about potential tampering with the bullet evidence as well. If we can't trust the physical evidence, what can we trust?
That's the challenge with this case. The possibility of evidence tampering throws the entire investigation into question.
This is heavy stuff. We're talking about a potential cover-up at the highest levels, a conspiracy to hide the truth about what really happened that day.
It's a lot to take in, for sure, and we're just getting started.
Yeah.
But before we move on to the next layer of this puzzle, let's pause here for a moment and let all of this sink in.
Okay.
Because if even a fraction of what we've discussed so far is true, it changes everything.
Absolutely. We need to really think about the implications of all this and how it challenges the narrative we've been told for so long. But for now, we'll leave you with that thought. Stay tuned for part 2 of your deep dive, where we'll delve even further into the mysteries surrounding the JFK assassination. Welcome back to your deep dive into the JFK assassination.
Okay.
Last time we left off talking about the possibility of evidence tampering,
Yeah.
even with the rifle and bullet fragments.
Right.
It's pretty unsettling to think about, isn't it?
It is.
But it leads us to another question.
Right.
If they were willing to go that far to manipulate the physical evidence,
Yeah.
what about the public's perception of Oswald?
That's a crucial point. In the hours and days following the assassination, there was a very deliberate effort to paint Oswald as a communist sympathizer
Right.
and solidify that image in the public's mind.
Yeah, it was almost instantaneous.
Right.
Like they had a playbook ready to go the moment the shots were fired.
That's exactly what it looks like when you dig into your sources.
Yeah.
We see figures like Jack Rogers from the Louisiana Un-American Activities Committee, LUAC,
Right.
and Congressman Edwin Willis from the House Un-American Activities Committee, HUAC, making pronouncements almost immediately linking Oswald to the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, or FPCC,
Yeah.
and other left-wing groups.
Just to clarify for our listeners, the FPCC was a group advocating for U.S. recognition of Castro's Cuba,
Right.
which was pretty controversial at the time.
Right. And these pronouncements from Rogers and Willis were happening within hours of the assassination, even though the investigation was just beginning.
Right.
Like they were trying to shape the narrative before all the facts were even in.
And it wasn't just pronouncements. We also have the curious case of former FBI agent Warren DeBranges, who went to the New Orleans Credit Bureau, asking very specific questions about Oswald's alleged connections to FPCC members and professors at Tulane University.
DeBrenge's actions are particularly strange
Yeah.
because it seems like he was trying to plant misleading information, creating a trail of false connections that would then be reported back to the FBI. And the timing of it all right on the heels of the assassination is incredibly suspicious.
So we have multiple agencies and individuals pushing this narrative of Oswald as a communist,
Yeah,
potentially even planting false information to support it.
right.
It's a coordinated effort to steer public perception, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. And then we have that memo from Bernard Wiseman, supposedly an employee of the U.S. Information Agency, or USIA.
Right. This is the one that linked Oswald to Chinese communist interests.
Exactly. And what's fascinating is that the memo focuses on the same individuals and organizations that HUAC and LUAC were targeting.
Right.
It suggests that these different groups were working together, pushing a unified narrative to solidify the image of Oswald as a communist acting on behalf of foreign powers.
It's a powerful narrative, one that plays on Cold War anxieties and fears of communist infiltration.
Yeah.
It's easy to see how the public could have been swayed by that kind of propaganda.
Especially in the immediate aftermath of such a shocking and traumatic event, people were looking for answers for someone to blame, and this narrative provided a convenient scapegoat.
And we can't forget Joseph Miltier, who went even further, distributing propaganda that blamed Jews and communists for the assassination.
Miltier's actions are particularly disturbing because they connect to a broader network of anti-communist and segregationist forces that might have seen the assassination as an opportunity to advance their own agendas.
It's a chilling thought that someone might exploit such a tragedy for political gain.
Yeah.
But it's not out of the realm of possibility when you consider the political climate at the time.
No, it's not, and it raises an important question.
Yeah.
Were these propaganda efforts simply opportunistic, or were they part of a larger premeditated plan?
It's hard to believe that such a coordinated and immediate response could have been purely coincidental.
Right.
They seem to be ready and waiting to pounce on this narrative.
And that brings us back to the physical evidence and the possibility of tampering. If they were willing to manipulate public perception so blatantly, it makes you wonder what else they were willing to do to ensure that Oswald was seen as the lone gunman.
Okay, so we've talked about the rifle and the bullets.
Yeah.
What other physical evidence are we looking at?
Well, there are Oswald's personal documents, for example.
His letters, his diary, that sort of thing?
Yes, but also more official documents like his employment application at the TSBD, his passport application, his post office box application, and various documents associated with his alias A.J. Heidel.
The alias he used to order the rifle?
Right.
But what's wrong with those documents?
Your sources suggest that many of them might be forgeries.
Really?
There are inconsistencies, discrepancies, and irregularities that raise serious doubts about their authenticity.
Wait, are you suggesting that someone forged those documents to frame Oswald?
It's a possibility that we can't dismiss.
Wow.
Motive would be clear to create a paper trail that incriminates Oswald and supports the lone gunman theory.
But that would take a lot of planning and coordination. Who would have the power to pull that off?
That's the question that haunts this entire case, isn't it?
Yeah.
Who had the means and the motive to manipulate the evidence so thoroughly?
It's mind-boggling to think that someone or some group could have orchestrated such a complex and elaborate scheme.
Yeah.
But the evidence you shared, the witness testimonies, the forged documents, the propaganda,
Right.
it all points in that direction.
It does, doesn't it? And it raises some very unsettling questions about who was really behind the assassination and what their motives might have been.
This is a lot to unpack, and I think it's important for our listener to take a moment and reflect on what we've covered so far.
Right.
The evidence suggests that there was a concerted effort to manipulate not only the physical evidence, but also the public's perception of Oswald.
It's a chilling reminder that things are not always as they seem, especially when powerful forces are at play.
We need to be willing to question the official narrative,
Yeah.
to dig deeper,
Right.
and to consider alternative explanations.
That's the essence of critical thinking, and it's especially important in a case like this where the stakes are so high and the truth has been so elusive.
Stay tuned for the final part of your deep dive, where we'll explore some more of the evidence and try to make sense of this tangled web of inconsistencies and unanswered questions. Welcome back to your deep dive into the JFK assassination. We've covered a lot of ground, haven't we?
We have.
From that strange encounter in North Dakota
Right.
to potentially tampered evidence and a coordinated propaganda campaign.
Right.
It seems like every step we take reveals another layer of intrigue.
It's a case that keeps on giving in terms of raising more questions than answers.
Yeah,
And the more we dig, the more we realize that the official narrative might not be the whole story.
exactly. And in this final part of our deep dive,
Okay.
we're going to zero in on some of the key pieces of physical evidence
Yeah.
and see if we can make sense of the discrepancies and inconsistencies that your sources highlighted. Let's start with those bullet fragments again.
Okay.
Yeah.
So as you recall, we have C-399, the nearly whole bullet, which supposedly passed through both President Kennedy and Governor Connolly.
Right, the magic bullet theory.
Yeah.
But even if we set aside the physics of that for a moment,
Right.
the way that bullet was discovered is incredibly suspect.
It is, isn't it?
Yeah.
It just appears on a stretcher at Parkland Hospital hours after the shooting, and the official explanation of how it got there is flimsy at best.
So you're saying there's a good chance it was planted?
It's a strong possibility. And then you have the other bullet fragments.
Right.
The ones that were too damaged to be conclusively matched to the rifle. Their origin is unclear, and there's a real possibility that they were switched out for something else.
Like maybe fragments shaved off of CE-399 itself
Right.
to create the illusion of more evidence.
That's one theory. And if that's the case,
Yeah.
it means that the forensic evidence, which is supposed to be the most reliable kind of evidence, might be completely compromised.
It's like a house of cards. If the foundation is built on lies, the whole structure collapses.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And it makes you wonder what other evidence might have been tampered with.
Right.
Or even fabricated outright.
It's a disturbing thought.
It is.
And it raises serious questions about the integrity of the entire investigation.
It does. And I think it's important to remember that this wasn't just some minor crime scene investigation.
Right.
This was the assassination of the President of the United States, one of the most powerful people in the world.
Right. The stakes were incredibly high.
And that means the potential for cover-ups and conspiracies is also incredibly high.
So where does that leave us? After reviewing all this material,
Wow.
all the inconsistencies and unanswered questions,
Yeah.
what's your take on the assassination?
Well, it's clear to me that we don't have the full picture.
Hmm.
There are too many gaps in the official narrative, too many things that don't add up.
Right.
The evidence suggests that there was a concerted effort to manipulate the investigation, to control the information flow, and to present a version of events that served a particular agenda.
And that agenda, it seems, was to pin the blame on Oswald and close the case as quickly as possible.
Exactly. But the more we learn about the case, the more we realize that Oswald might not have been the lone wolf assassin he was portrayed to be. He might have been a patsy, a pawn in a much larger game.
A game with players and motives that we may never fully understand.
Perhaps. But that doesn't mean we should stop asking questions.
I agree. In fact, I think it's more important than ever to keep digging,
Yeah.
to keep challenging the official narrative,
Right.
and to keep searching for the truth. This deep dive has been a real eye-opener.
Yeah.
And I think it's safe to say that we haven't heard the last word on the JFK assassination.
Mhm.
There's still so much to uncover, so many mysteries to unravel.
And you, the listener, have a role to play in that. Don't take anything at face value. Question everything. Do your own research. You might just uncover something that changes the way we understand history.
That's a great point. The truth is out there somewhere.
Yeah.
And the more people who are looking for it, the better the chance we have of finding it. So keep digging, keep questioning, and most importantly, keep an open mind. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We hope you found it informative and thought-provoking. And who knows, maybe it's even inspired you to do some digging of your own.